trying to get started. That's not when people work in Keynote, so when you build a team, you don't want to say, oh, you can't go on this team because you don't speak whatever, Russian. And so, yeah.
Okay, we admire your perseverance. Now an announcement. For those of you that hang out long enough, there will be free beer. So after the last session, which will actually be in California, we will have a short session in California before we wrap up, and we wrap up day one. We actually plan to share with you some local beer, network, and then the Passionate Mariner Hall. And I and a few others will for sure have to walk the harbor to see if there's any hot stuff to look at. So those of you that have the time are more than welcome to join us and look at some really cool boats. Okay.
So let's welcome our next keynote speaker, Odence, who is here from Black Duck Software. Philip is responsible for expanding Black Duck's reach, image, and product breadth to partnerships with the open source, legal, and commercial communities. Thank you very much for coming, and warm welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I always learn my duck, and I always try to learn from previous speakers, and one of the things I've learned is that you need to drink some water here to have a little bit of enough. Thank you for inviting me. Really appreciate it, and I really appreciate being in great company with speakers from Red Hat, Microsoft, and tomorrow Kongsberg, certainly Google. So poor little Black Duck joins in, so we felt like we needed to bring the duck. Oh, extra, thank you. But we feel in great company. So, and I guess I'd also like to thank Jim for twisting my arm a little bit to come. And it shouldn't have taken a twist. I'm a sailor, and really like a kid in a candy store, being both in the museum and across from the marina there. It's fantastic. I talked to two other sailors today, both of whom told me they had small boats and proceeded to tell me their small boats were both over 30 feet. So I thought I would share my small boat. It's about 15 feet long. It's called a Keynote skiff, and raced on Cape Cod, which is just south of Boston, as you can see there. And I guess the novel thing about the Keynote skiff is that the design has not changed since about the year 1905. There's a little picture there from the 20s. You can see it looks very much the same as Swamp Fox does today. Swamp Fox was built in 1939, rebuilt a couple of times since, the first time by my father and I in 75, and then we gave it another go a few years ago. We get about 30 boats on the starting line most Saturday mornings. This is the biggest race ever with 66 boats. So anyway, that's my interest in sailing. We don't use a lot of navigation equipment except these occasionally. So let me also give you, so that's me, a little bit about Black Duck. We're a software company primarily. We also offer services. And what we're into is helping software development organizations really manage their use of open source. I think Jim gave a great talk this morning with an introduction to open source. So we help with strategy, policy, and process. We provide services advising companies on that. We provide products that support that. Our product is called the Black Duck Suite. And then we also work with the open source community quite a bit. And I would include this as part of the open source reach that we do. In fact, I probably need to get a MARSEC logo on here along with some of the others. And I'll just say we work in, that was a fairly international group. We work in 24 countries. I don't think we have any customers in Malta yet, but we're working on that. And we do have about 1,000 customers, and some of the companies I mentioned earlier today are customers of ours. So I'm taking a little bit of liberty. We are going to talk about managing IP. That's part of the presentation today. But I'm also going to go through a little bit of what we see going on in open source. And to give you a sense there, I didn't mention about Black Duck. Most of our products, a a service to the community, is to provide that information. And then I'm going to talk about super communities, because we're talking about IP management and super communities, so a little bit about what we're seeing going on there. Then IP management, and finally, I think it would be interesting to you all to hear a little bit about Geneva, which I think is a good example for this organization to look at from a number of aspects, not only IP management, and I'll touch on that then. I'm also going to try to keep an eye on the clock because I know I tend to go on. So if you've not seen it, I recommend this article. It was written by Mark Andreessen. It was just about a year ago. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and it's a fantastic article describing all of the different ways that software permeates everyone's lives and across so many different industries, from healthcare, financial services, oil and gas, to really any industry you can think of. Even for somebody well entrenched in the software business and touching a lot of those communities, I found it very inspiring. And equally, I think that anywhere that software is eating the world, I'll say there's a growing appetite, if you will, for open source. Anywhere that software is hot, and it's hot everywhere, open source is very hot, to the point where this analyst from Gartner says that if you're not using open source, you're at a competitive disadvantage. I think we've talked quite a bit about today about innovation, and I think I am one of the believers that free and open source software helps to foster innovation, and equally innovation, of course, builds the quality of free and open source software. So you do get a virtuous cycle going, and in virtuous cycles you get exponential growth. And here's some stats from our knowledge base on the growth of the number of open source projects out there in the world. So today it's topping 600,000 projects, well on its way to 1 million projects. This represents upwards of 100 billion lines of code, to just throw out a big number. And we've even done some numbers on what it would take if you wanted to hire somebody to develop that code. And let's just say it's a lot of money. So where it's hot, if you pick any of the hot areas in IT and technology today, whether it's cloud or mobile, or we equally could have had big data here. Healthcare is a big issue. In all of those areas, you don't need to focus on the numbers. These are numbers of new projects each year, but there are hundreds of new projects each year in all these areas, thousands in some. The big thing to focus on is that they all show the exponential growth and the adoption of open source. So very big stuff. We're all in a very good place. And these are the, if you sort of closed your eyes and started talking about who are the hot companies these days in technology, who are the companies that are really changing the game. You have some of them represented here. It's all of those companies are basing much of what they do on open source. Some of them basing all of what they do on open source. And so certainly it's a good place to be. I think people who know of open source tend to think about the data center first, tend to think about Linux, tend to think about Apache Tomcat. Certainly that's been a big place for the development of open source, but it goes well beyond that. It's in the networks that connect those data centers. It's in the desktop applications that run applications from those data centers. I'll not take this phone call now. Trying to put it away. Sorry, Robert. And it's in these things. Somebody, I think Jim today mentioned Android as being open source. Well, if you've got one of these iPhones, go into the setup area and settings area, legal, and you will get more screens than you can imagine of very tiny fonts, licensing information about open source licenses that are contained in this phone. And then beyond that, into cars, which we'll talk about today, and by the way, even ships. I think you all know. So let's talk a little bit about how software development works. Not the way it does when some of the grayer of us were in school, when you started with a blank screen and typing some characters. It's really today much more about assembling pieces. You may find those pieces from something that you've worked on previously, or somebody else in your group, or somebody else across your organization, or you may go outside of your organization. It's not new news that many companies use commercial third-party components, or they outsource work. So suddenly you can see that IP management, I realize that I'm speaking not just strictly about open source software, but really free software in general. Interestingly, when that code comes in, it's not the case as with some of these other sources that money goes in the other direction, but there are obligations that flow from using the software. And some of those are legal obligations. I think that's primarily what I'm referring to, and that's where getting into IP management is important. And I'll just say that the picture actually gets a little more complex even because many of those outsourcers, I'll say most of those commercial third parties who might be building code for you or its components you might be using are in fact also using open source. So development today is based on components, it's about assembling them together, and virtually all of those components either are open source or contain open source. And that's a good thing, by the way. Gartner did a survey of their customers. These were mostly data center sort of customers, IT organizations within other companies. And they found that in their customer base, about 29% of the code being used was open source. I'm frankly not sure how they collected the data, whether it was just interviews and asking. And I do know that this kind of data can be suspect or unknown. I suspect the number might be bigger. I don't know if you've, Jim, you may have seen this trick. I've seen a few guys do it at conferences where they say, how many of you are using open source? And some hands go up. And then how many of you are using Linux? And more hands go up. A lot of hands go up. And what that's saying is people aren't even thinking of Linux as something any different. They're thinking of it as open source. It's just the water in which the fish is swimming, if you will. So I think this number might be a little low. But we've seen organizations, and it's interesting to me how many times the 80% number was thrown out today. I don't think there's any scientific evidence of that, but there's many statistics. If you say it enough and people think it feels right, that turns into a reality. But we think that's best in class, and so there's really this value that companies can capture by going beyond what they're using to 80%. And we talked today about why that's valuable, because it's not the 80%, it's the 20% where you can focus your limited resources that really is the extra value. So here's an example, and this does, I suppose, substantiate the 80% a little. At least we have one data point of a company, a big company, Sony Ericsson Mobile, which stood up and said they're using 80% in their phones, and we've certainly seen customers of ours who are doing the same. I heard one fellow was a CIO type guy in an enterprise IT organization say that his rule is don't develop anything that you can't download. So if you can get it for free, use it and put your extra energy into that other 20%. So we talked a little bit about innovation, and I really liked your point. Actually, you guys stole my thunder a little bit with what I was going to say here. But Bill Joy said that no matter who you are, no matter what company you are, no matter how many of the smartest people you hire, many of them are working for somebody else. And they're not all competitors, by the way. Many of them are customers. And I think that's really what a big part of the value of the community is, bringing the customers in. Because in a lot of ways, particularly as the market matures, customers are the smartest of all, at least about the problems that they're trying to solve. I think somebody else quoted Hibble earlier. Perhaps it was, I know you didn't quote it, but it was one of your citations. So this is some explanation, and these are some guys from Harvard Business School, so they're real smart. Actually, some guys. Donnie is a guy, and Meta is a woman. So they found this fellow Hay in 1945 said that knowledge is distributed unevenly. And as I say, I think a lot of that's for customers. I suspect, and I should have researched before I got here, I suspect some of where he was coming from was maybe looking and maybe taking a shot at the rise of the USSR at that point, and Stalin and central planning and all that. But I think if you read the article, that's really what we're talking about. Is you can't really have, there's certainly no, Stalin was no genius that can really plan the whole Soviet economy, and nor in any company is there any one person who's really smart enough to lay it all got all these smart people and customers, but you can't go hire from your customers because you get in trouble. So you need other ways to get at it. And that really comes down to distributed innovation in communities, where it started in academia. I think there was some allusion to this today, but some of the earliest work in software was at the MIT Media Lab. That's where Richard Stallman came from. He was the guy who wrote the GPL license and really started, some of his genius was he started the whole open source thing. But the way the world worked, the way the software world worked when it was back only in academia, essentially, was exactly the way the open source world works today. Everybody shared, everything got traded. It was building on the shoulders of others, just the way academic pursuits work today in other areas. And so then that starts to build up a community, which brings in people from not necessarily academia, but from outside academia. And that's what the open source movement, the licensing support brought in. And then that community starts to get interested to commercial entities, and that's what you really need, and that's what we're talking about here today, is distributed innovation. We've had academics and students and community folks, Jim, I'll put you in that bit, and then folks from commercial companies all working together to solve the problem, and that's really where this distributed innovation comes from. So a consequence of all this is what we're calling super communities, and I think that term is not caught on yet, but I'm starting to see it around. So what we're really talking about is a community that grows up inside a vertical. And I'll give you a hint. I'm seeing MARSEC-XL, MARSEC as being a super community. So it grows up inside a vertical, and it is a network of the communities within that vertical. Typically self-organizing, and typically involved in the supply chain. So, as I said, some of those smartest people that we'd like to work with are out at the end of the supply chain, i.e. they're your customers, but some of them are back upstream as well. Your suppliers and their suppliers, and ultimately, like what I'm saying about open source, a lot of the are called the upstreams, the originators of the open source software. So that's where a lot of the smartness is. And I'm not the first person to say that what that collaboration does within that super community then is allows everyone to collaborate on the lowest value-added components of what they do. And then to engage in co-opetition, if you will, to achieve industry-wide goodness. So I don't think I need to explain it. I think we've talked about it today. And the activities that these super communities are characterized as similarly to the activities of any open source project. It's collaborative, it's transparent, it's meritocracy-based, and all of this stuff's been said before today. One of the benefits is it reduces the dependence on any single entity. I think at least one of the models that Jim talked about was maybe less so in the walled garden sort of scenario. There still is a single entity which is driving the boat a little bit, but there's still always the opportunity to fork, and we see it happen occasionally when somebody is when an entity is imposing their will too much and maybe building walls that are too high around that garden. There is the opportunity to fork. We've seen it happen. There was a project called Hudson that got forked. It has to do with building software or controlling the building software, and there was a big fork last year where a bunch of folks, in fact, the originator of Hudson took Jenkins off in a slightly different direction. I think they're more or less on parallel courses now, but there is that opportunity, even in that scenario, for the community essentially to revolt against a single entity that's not doing the job. But ultimately, and most importantly, it's about increasing rates of innovation. So we're seeing it in a lot of different areas, and this is not meant to be comprehensive. These are ones that my company is touching. In healthcare, there's a group called Coursera. You may, with socialized medicine in a lot of European countries, you may have less of the States, health records are hell to deal with. If I go to my doctor and then I go to the hospital, they don't have access to the same records. If I move to another city or I change healthcare providers, it gets even worse. And so Vocera is actually growing out of the largest healthcare system in the U.S., which is the Veterans Administration. It's the healthcare system that takes care of veterans who served in the defense of the U.S. And they're driving this organization to build a common platform for healthcare records. They're not dissimilar to some of the communication challenges that Fred was talking about earlier. So the different entities within an ecosystem can communicate with each other. Aerospace, there's a group called Holisys that's a little different from some of these others, and they're involved in building tools, not the product itself, but tooling around the product. What they're dealing with is aircraft that have to last 30 or 40 years, and how do you know that the tooling that built the software for those aircraft will be around for as long as the aircraft will need to be around. This extends into hardware. There's a group that's building open. I can't even read it myself, but these guys come and talk at Linux Foundation conferences. They came out of Facebook. You don't think of Facebook as a hardware company, but they've driven this open hardware community around data center sorts of hardware servers. Babylon is one that's just started up in Europe. It's looking at more physical parts of embedded systems. OpenStack, I think you're familiar with. I didn't even put the word Android on the Android guide because everybody knows him. I did, by the way, use this slide, and I'll talk a little more about it in a presentation I did last week, and gave a little bit of a pitch for MARSEC-XL. Receiving in finance, OpenMama is a messaging platform for handling very high speed, lots of messaging, the kind of volumes that happens behind the New York Stock Exchange. In fact, it was developed by the New York Stock Exchange IT organization. And that's one where they certainly see other industries, perhaps telecommunications, for example, that may be able to take advantage of that. Lodestone is very much along the lines of the model we've been talking about, where competitors get together and develop the baseline themselves. That was started by Deutsche Bank. It's really just starting up. I think frankly, MARSEC is much further along than Lodestone at this point. So you're not the new kids on the block anymore. It's and there will be plenty of other projects started in other industries. I think in automotive there's a bunch going on. Those foundations doing some interesting stuff with their working group. Linux Foundation just announced I think it's called Automotive Grade Linux Project that was announced just a couple of weeks ago. And then Geneva I'll talk about more, so I won't say anything. This was my talk I did last week. I feel funny I'm showing lots of pictures of myself, but there's other people here too. And it was at the Open World Forum, which is one of the premier open source events in Europe. It's held in Paris every year. Paul Operating from Kness, you know, is the space agency in France. Airbus, everybody knows. This is a tools company that's working with the Eclipse Foundation. Vallejo is a company that makes IOOI, in-vehicle entertainment systems, and who knows one of the important guys in Geneva. And then Mo is the guy who was talking about open hardware. It was very interesting, and in the spirit of reuse, I had asked of the panel the question, what does it take for the super community to be successful? smaller entities in these sorts of communities. And that's one thing a smaller entity can bring to bear that the bigger guys might not. So the big guys might buck up, and the small guys might be willing to do the work, and in fact, in some cases, even get contracted to do some of the work. And then, we talked a lot about co-opetition and what it takes to make everybody work together. And one of the things that certainly came out of that is IP management. Because, you have competitors, everybody's playing nice, but you need some level of IP management to keep that niceness happening. So now I'll talk a little bit about IP management in general, and I'm gonna kind of slide between talking about organizations, companies, and then talking about communities, because I think there's many of the same issues between the two. So Gardner, I mentioned earlier, this report came out I think November last year. Very interesting. It was the same report in which they reported that 29% of their company's code bases were open source. And they also came out with a prediction that here's another percentage that I think is low. They said that 50% of companies will face challenges due to a lack of policy and management of their open source. Some of those challenges they talked about because they did enumerate them. Some of them had to do with IP, but not all. There were also potential issues with security and quality in some other areas. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I think the fundamental challenge, really the basis for the challenge, is managing the fact that there's so much open source stuff around. It's just mind-boggling, and it's hard for individuals to navigate. It's equally hard for companies to navigate. So here's some of the stats I already threw out: the 650,000 plus across 5,000 different sites, by the way. So if there's something good out there, you can't just go to SourceForge or GitHub or Apache and find just the right thing. Tens of millions of lines of code, and as we're going to get into IP management, by the way, 2,200 licenses. Jim talked about the OSI and Free Software Foundation. OSI recognizes, I think, 67 licenses today. I don't know about MSF, but probably 120-ish. So, you've got another 2,000 licenses out there with the beer license that most people have heard of, lots of crazy licenses. Lots of them just small variations on the theme. But for lawyers, they don't like that. They would really like to deal with licenses they know about. So this is some of the big value that OSI brings, which is lawyers can study a relatively small list. The good news is it's much more than an 80-20 rule. It's a 98-2 rule that says, what I mean by that is, if you take something on the order of the top 20 licenses, that covers probably 98% of the software that's out there. So that makes it a little more tractable, but at the same time it says, any developer could grab one of these some code under one of these licenses that's unknown or potentially problematic. And so really the issue, there used to be one way for third-party software into an organization, and that was through a purchasing arm that was well-trained in asking the right questions and reading licenses and dealing with those things. Now, if you have 1,000 developers, you've got 1,000 different paths by which third-party software can come into the company. Any developer with a browser can get at any of upwards of 1 million projects. And so it's inherently difficult to manage. And within a supply chain, and I think the reality is we're talking about working in a supply chain here. We're not just talking about guys who build ships. We're not just talking about the guys who build instruments, because somebody's providing software to the guys who build instruments. Some of it's outsourced, and on and on and on. As you get a supply chain, that little fractal I sort of talked about, how software gets developed today, gets multiplied back through the supply chain, ultimately back to the open source project. And by the way, the open source projects need to and do manage the IP on their own. Just to give you a sense for the kind of issues and complexity I'm referring to, I'll quickly touch on Android. Phone users think of Android as a thing. The reality is there are 165 components in Android. Some of them developed by the Android community, many of them external. Android is available under the Apache 2 license, but if you dig different licenses inside Android. Some of them licenses that have the reciprocal character, which generally is described in GPL2 and the LGPL, and even a couple of non-OSI approved licenses. So a lot of potential complexity there, because what happens is the guys building the phones, or suppliers of the guys building the phones, take Apache, use some parts, don't use others, rearrange them around, and technical decisions they make can have legal implications. So, an example, we won't go through this at all. This is a high-level architecture of what Android looks like. Inside Android is a little component called Toolbox, covered by Apache 2, also BSD, a very permissive license, nothing anybody would worry about. My friend Mark Radcliffe, who's one of the top attorneys on open source in the US, was at a conference. A developer was talking about his Android implementation and said, I found something better than Toolbox. It was a component called BusyBox, so that's what I'm using. Well, it turns out the BusyBox is GPL, and it is the most actively enforced license and component. There's been a lot of litigation around it, and this guy stood up in front of 500 people and said, "I'm shipping a phone with this component that has a license that really compromises the intellectual property of the whole phone and is completely incompatible with the Apache 2 license." So lots of room for error. None of this is to scare anyone away from open source. It's a good thing. You should be using it. You should be getting that 29% to 80%. It just says you have to be careful. Being careful means starting with a strategy. Jim's a good strategy. And there are others. That really articulates what are you trying to do with open source. You need a policy and process. And I do outreach to smaller companies. In fact, I was at an event in Seattle that was put on by Microsoft, or sponsored by Microsoft, reaching out to small companies. And I'll tell those small companies, no matter how small you are, no matter how young you are, you need a strategy, you need a process. The process may be, go ask Bob, because Bob knows about open source. That's fine. You also need some technology to automate it. And in that small company where the policy is go ask Bob, the technology could very well be a spreadsheet to keep track of it. That works fine. But as you get bigger, more complex, multiple product lines, multiple development centers, it gets more difficult. You need fancy software. But what my company does is provide the fancy software, the technology to really automate the policies. We also provide strategy and policy process and so on. So that's the challenge. It's quite manageable. It shouldn't scare anybody off. There's no fun here, but you just have to be wise about it. I'll talk a little bit about Geneva, and I think that most of the lessons learned I was going to bring to the floor here are around IP management, because that was the talk. But it occurred to me as we were sitting here today, it really was while we were sitting here today, that a lot of what Geneva's trying to do parallels the standard maritime architecture. And I think there's probably at least principles that we learn by looking at what they're doing, and there may even be code to be shared. So I'd encourage you to look at that. So Geneva is an open source super community around automotive IVI, in-vehicle infotainment system, and it's much more than tunes and navigation these days. There's so much to it. The trend in the auto industry has been shifting towards software, shifting towards new players, IT companies you never thought about being in automotive, and for the IVI unit to go, as I say, well beyond just tunes and navigation to include multiple users, social media, the back seat, all kinds of stuff. And there's a lot of other things going on beyond the IVI to always on. There's a connected car consortium that's talking about providing data to the car, very much like a ship we like, and probably going back in the other direction about hazards and traffic conditions and police, etc. So I do think the parallels there. There's a lot to be learned. I think the big drive for these guys is a little different than what I think the maritime industry is facing. They're really getting squeezed by short development cycles, by long life cycles in cars versus the competition. And really what it comes going to compete with these guys? Okay, are you going to listen to your tunes through this? Are you going to use Apple Maps, or are you going to use something integrated on the car? Are the consumers going to force the car manufacturers to simply let you drop your iPhone or Android into the dash and not charge them for an IBI? So these guys are facing, to develop a new IBI, 3 to 4 years, and the car stays around for much longer than that, as you can see. So very different time frames and challenges here, and they're spending ungodly amounts of money to get there. So the amount of software in the car is going up rapidly, the complexity and standards, a lot of difficulty to deal with. It just simply made sense for the competitors to get together. The infotainment system in particular, and I don't like this slide, it's purely here to show 100 million lines of code and growing, and that's in a car from 3 years ago, across the whole car. But 70% of that was in the IBI, and I think this is a very conservative estimate that the GDP Foundation uses, $1 to $10 a line. I've heard numbers as high as $20 per line of code to develop a system like that. So clearly, it was untenable for any one manufacturer to handle. And so they started Geneva. The mission was to build this standard IBI platform. I think I've talked about most of this. I'm going to move forward because I'm running short on time. I can't believe I grabbed a version of this slide that didn't have Black Duck on it, but this shows all of the members of the crew members as well. What it's really supposed to show is it's not just the guys you think of as car companies at the top, or even what they call the first tier suppliers, maybe you're aware of, which you can see Bosch on your radio. There's all kinds of companies at that level, but it goes all the way back to a million providers of middleware and other services, even navigation services, and then right back to the guys who are developing the chips that go into the vehicles. And so, Fred, you talked about ARM this morning as one of the platforms for sensors. Are they on the list? My gosh, there they are. So I think if we're thinking the equivalent of the first tiers in the maritime business, I think we should be thinking broader and further upstream. There's the 80% again. And this just says, Geneva is trying to do exactly what we're all trying to do in this room today. A layer between the hardware and the application that's common and shared amongst the manufacturers. This is how they're organized. The one thing I want you to see is, as you can imagine, there's guys who worry about all the different subsystems in the car. There's a group that manages the whole thing, but a license review team. Okay, it's important enough to Geneva that they have a box, as big as the auto expert box dedicated to license review. I'll go through this quickly. Bearing Point did a study. They're a consultancy based in Europe. They work with a fellow from the University of Berlin in Nuremberg, and here's what they found. They found that only 15% of the companies they interviewed in the automotive space in Europe are not using open source. Therefore, 85% are. And they asked them about their governance policies. The vast majority of them had policies and processes to govern software development. Very, very few of them had any processes in place to govern the use of open source. Some really small numbers there. So that was the big concern, and only 2%, 3% of them had any tools in place to help them manage the use of open source and the licensing around it. So Geneva, very early on, stepped back. They engaged Bearing Point mostly for this. They worked with consultants from my company as well to develop a strategy around their supply chain and around how they were going to govern open source. So each piece of code that comes into Geneva gets checked. The little black duck up there means they use our stuff, which is great, but it doesn't. There are other ways to do it. We do an inbound check on the licensing of each piece of code that goes in, and then when they package it up, and before they send it out to the tier ones who ultimately start working with the package, there's another check going outbound to make sure that the licensing policies are adhered to. And that's how they implemented it. The key was starting with the strategy, creating this process, and putting the policies in place. So I think I'm changing the world. Open source is changing software. Super communities are driving open source in a bunch of industries. I'm sure there's some I don't know about, but I'm also sure that there are many industries that are behind the 8 ball. The maritime industry is in front of many with the efforts of everyone here today. And to realize the full benefits of ensure compliance with there's a whole lot of things you need to do, but certainly IP management is an important element of that. And I didn't say it earlier, but in your recruiting efforts, I think it's going to be really important to be able to tell these companies, talk to some of the savvy companies in particular, be able to tell them, here's what we're doing with IP management, here's the licensing we've selected, here's some of the processes that are in place, here's how we're helping to protect you and protect the customers. And that'll go a long way, I think, to help. I'm also going to put this up. I guess these slides will be available. These are free resources I'd recommend if you're interested in learning more. If you're interested in legal aspects of open source, if you don't know about these licenses, you picked up a little bit from Jim today. But we've got a great series of webinars that are recorded. Each one takes about 45 minutes. There are a couple on the basics of open source licensing. There's one on the top 10 licenses in particular of each one. We have an open source resource center with a lot of good information. OLO is our free online directory of open source projects, and you can go in there and research, 500,000 different projects with information on how active they are, what license they're under, where they are, what they do, help assess useful software. We're going to have to get MARSA up there. Jim and I were talking about it earlier. And then the last thing I'll recommend is our Open Source Delivers blog. It's quite good. Most of the contributors are outside of Black Duck, about 40% of the contributions are from Black Duck. And I picked this screenshot in particular because we did celebrate International Talk Like a Pirate Day this year, which I thought was appropriate. I thought I had a thank you slide, so I'll just say thank you and certainly open for any questions.
Any questions from the audience?
I've got to know this.
Jim?
We've been talking about the saving of resources, like time and energy. But how much time does it affect the development cycles? Does the Geneva, for example, you had a timeline that said something like 4 years of development was required. How quickly were they able to cut that down by using open source and creating the super community around it?
Yeah, well, so good question. And early days with Geneva, they're really still in startup mode. They just started putting out reference designs recently, and they've open sourced them within the last several months. They were using an open innovation model, I would say, but within the membership, and it was kind of a big deal for them to open up further than that, and they made the decision to do it and have done so. I think that BMW is planning to start shipping Geneva compliant product in 2014, and I think there's no question that there would be some postmortem on what it did for the development effort. But we don't know there. Certainly, the math is not as simple as if you're using 80% open source, therefore you're only doing 20% of the work, therefore it should be 1/5 of the time. Because I think, as somebody said earlier, there's some overhead just finding the components, bringing them in, doing the IP management, and that's really why it's important to automate all this stuff. And I think some of the discussion on YouTube was interesting in this respect as well. You need the infrastructure in place, and I didn't emphasize that, but infrastructure for co-contribution and building and all that stuff. And so the more automation, the less overhead there is. But my guess is you're talking more on the order of 2x, 3x gains. And as I say, I'm confident that the data
It's actually more of a comment than a question. I spent 3 years of my life with IBM in the acquisition team. So we were able to acquire. We came in. I was on the engineering side, so we came in when the decision was close to be made. And said, okay, let's go and buy software. I would estimate that about a third of my time, or the team's time, was going into figuring out how deep of trouble we get if we actually bought the company and integrated the software. So maybe one aspect for people listening in, it is not all only thinking about what software am I using and am I getting in trouble using it. It's also an aspect of looking forward if you're a startup or if you create your own piece of software that you want to be acquired eventually, to think forward a couple of years about what these guys have to go through to evaluate, to look at your code, evaluate the code, and evaluate the liability they acquire when you have to be careful in calling out exactly which pieces you took from where and under which license.
Absolutely, and let me just underscore that. About 10 or 15% of Black Duck's business is helping companies in exactly IBM's situation here. We get brought in on between 4 and 6 technical due diligence efforts on behalf of acquirers each week. So in any given week, we've got about 5 of these things going, and we're coming in and analyzing the code and helping the acquirer to get comfortable with what they're buying, what it is, and what remediation would have to take place, if any. What I can tell you from talking to lots of acquirers is they'll start with asking the questions: what open source are you using? Bad answer number 1 is, I'm not sure, let me get back to you on that one. That doesn't work very well. Bad answer number 2 is, we don't use open source. The good answer is, we have a strategy, we have a policy, let me tell you about it. Here's the process by which we track it, and here's the spreadsheet that lists what components we use where. And I think most of those acquirers will still go through an effort to due diligence. They'll still bring us in, but they'll feel much more comfortable, not just in the risk around the open source, but that that company has a competently run development organization that knows what they're doing, and so it has great confidence. So I think it's really good.
Thank you. A comment that we actually wanted to, we thought we maybe should say it at the conference, but since it's not completed, we saved it for later. But since you mentioned OpenMama, earlier this year we detected one of the challenges for MARSEC is that we do not really currently have completely the real-time messaging system support that we need. So we have the Linux.com, and we ran into the OpenMama people, and being open, they said it would be wonderful if we could like to integrate OpenMama in MARSEC. Wow! And
That's great.
when we analyze that, you can see that with OpenMama in MARSEC, we will be able to cater for all real-time requirements from alarm handling, and the requirements in OpenMama are actually stricter than what we can currently see on Energy. So that solves the problem. They will stop.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I truly believe that there is some of those same kind of synergies with Geneva.
That's for sure. We've also been in contact with them.
I went by the small logos fast, Tom, and Carmen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great talk.